Thank you very much, Antonia. I really want to say, well, I'm very sad that I'm sorry I'm going to give my lecture in English. It's very lazy of me, but I did give my other one in German, so I don't feel so bad. I just really wanted to say how much I've really enjoyed my time here and how productive it's been. And I wanted to thank the two directors, Günter Blamberg and Dietrich Boschel, and everybody really, the staff who've been so helpful and have really just made it an absolute pleasure to be here, a lovely building, lovely surroundings, and also all the other fellows too. So thank you very much, and I'm quite sad to be going back. It's gone very quickly. So unlike the people who were on yesterday who had the challenge of keeping people from falling asleep, I'm going to have to try to wake you up, being first thing in the morning. So let's see how we go with the technology. Portraits and biographical sketches of Stasi informants, popular in the media in the early 1990s, liked to present collaboration with East German secret police as a cut and dried affair. After unification, individuals whose lives were entangled with the infamous Staatssicherheitsdienst were quickly classified either as victims or perpetrators. If there was evidence, for instance, that the accused had signed a Verpflichtungserklärung to work unofficially, as the term was, for the Stasi, this was deemed irrefutable proof that the individual was a spy, a denunciator, and hence a perpetrator, or Täter was the official term used. To this day, the presence or otherwise of an incriminating signature registered in the Stasi's ministerial archives and now preserved in a government agency, the Bundesbeauftragte, or the Stasi Archive, as I refer to it, has remained the master signifier, shaping public perceptions of the lives of those who came into contact with the Stasi. It is, along with the factuality of an archived EM Vorgangsakte or informant file, what could be regarded as a marker or a hallmark of a closed Stasi perpetrator biography. In reality, many portraits and biographies of Stasi informants that scholars have constructed from the Stasi archives are far more open and indeterminate than is commonly believed. Curiously, the archives had not helped us construct holistic or comprehensive biographies of the lives who came into the contact with the Stasi, or easily separate perpetrators from victims. And this is actually despite the fact that victim files, as I show you here, are actually quite distinct from perpetrator files. Sometimes you might get the perpetrator file placed in the victim file, but they are actually distinctly classified and coded. This is in part because many informants later became opponents or dissidents of the regime. A substantial number of writers, and my project has been mainly about writers, for instance, whom the Stasi enlisted as informants, were later placed under secret police surveillance. The files do not always present readers with unequivocal portraits of all targeted individuals, nor do they offer coherent, uncontradictory accounts of their lives. Some perpetrator files even present strikingly open forms of life writing and portraiture. And this is despite Stasi officers' attempts to create order, eliminate chance and contingency, and to reduce arbitrariness or Willkür in the handling of informants and the filing of reports, those points that Günter Blamberger referred to in his opening talk, that the biographer tries to control. While such files are still rich and useful historical sources, informant files often raise new sets of questions to which there are no easy answers. An example of an open portrait and biography which still continues to fascinate is the case of underground East German poet Sasha Anderson. Excuse me if I do say Anderson, that's my Australian strain, my bad Australian accent coming through. The case of Anderson is especially intriguing. A random portrait of Anderson is especially intriguing because it serves to demonstrate the power of the Stasi archives to refigure portraits and to rewrite life stories of those caught in the Stasi's web. When it was revealed in 1991 that Anderson had worked for an informant for almost 15 years, the public's perception of him as a leading member, indeed as the spiritus rector, of the East German political and cultural underground was exposed as a monumental illusion. In this paper, I'll attempt to show that both the pre- and post-unification portraits of Anderson and the biographical sketches that accompany him are misleading and oversimplifying. I'll explore public perceptions in the media, but also amongst Anderson's peers before and after 1990, and compare them to what we now know from the Stasi files. I'll also attempt to examine mainly literary and scholarly portraits and biographical sketches, as well as Anderson's poetry briefly and some of his autobiographical statements. And in my slides, I'll juxtapose the textual portraits with some visual portraits of Anderson, which I'll only really analyse very, very briefly because I'm not a literary historian, but I just discovered more and more portraits and found them so fascinating, so I'll be interested to see what people make of them. And I'll tease out maybe a couple of tentative connections. In the mid-80s, let's see if I can try this. Anderson is... Oh, is this going to work? He's down the bottom there anyway. The woman's got his hair... I don't think I can get this to work. Is this working? Oh, it's down there. There he is, I think, there. In the mid-80s, Anderson was widely regarded as one of the regime's shooting stars amongst the next generations of writers and poets. He was the most visible, active and iconic member of the artistic underground that was synonymous with the rundown East Berlin district of the Prenzlauer Berg. I quickly discovered this when I spent 4 weeks in East Berlin as a fee-paying postgraduate Australian student in 1986. Like many of the others of this generation I met, Anderson was a Bohemian Aussteiger, a dropout, with literary and artistic interests and massive pretensions. Excluded from participation in the official socialist public sphere, Anderson and his peers withdrew into private spaces which belonged to a much wider Nischengesellschaft, that a term Günter Gauss has coined, that evolved across the GDR. The subcultural or countercultural enclaves to which Anderson belonged were uniformly lauded in the West as an authentic form of artistic expression and a grassroots social movement. Thus, a myth was forged of autonomy and resistance to state power, in which the Prenzlauer Berg poets eked out an existence in semi-illegality, in dilapidated housing, far from the prying eyes of the state. The poets practiced a politics and aesthetics that was distinct from the more political writing of the older generation, exemplified in the singer-songwriter Wolf Biermann, and the modernism of the likes of Christoph Wolff, Christoph Hein, Volker Braun, and others. Anderson and his friends were scornful of the orthodox aesthetics of socialist realism and embraced impulses from Dadaism, surrealism, concrete poetry, beat, and the avant-garde. As Frank Wolf Matthijs wrote in 1981, wir leben in einem Land, das von Surrealisten beherrscht wird. In addition, they read illegally imported Western editions of post-structuralist theory by Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, Jean Baudrillard and others. East Berlin's unique cityscape with its impassable borders, rundown housing, as you can see here, and labyrinthine internal courtyard systems of Hinterhöfe, erste und zweite Hinterhöfe, form part of a cultural biotope which held its inhabitants, even those Bohemians in the Prenzlauer Berg and in other cities, strangely captive. The poets neither wanted to escape the confines of the East, nor did they believe in the socialist project as officially propagated. As Karen Leder writes, they were consumed by a sense of being born too late, of being born into a pre-programmed reality, of lateness, as Leder says. Uwe Kolber has described his generation as the Hineingeborene in a poetry volume, Lutz Rathenau as a zu spät Geborene, and Anderson speaks more radically of a noch nicht geboren sein. As Stefan Döring, another of the poets, wrote ambiguously, speaking for an entire generation of outsiders, ich fühle mich in Grenzen wohl. Innerhalb von Grenzen, but also to a limited extent. Anderson spoke for many when he wrote in his first volume of poetry, shown here, Ich hab mich satt gefressen am Fleisch im Widerstand. They practiced instead in disinterested commentary from the periphery. As Anderson writes, die Zusammenhänge sind einfach und irreal. They learned to live with the many contradictions and political walls that became internalized in body ones, as reflected in a poem by Anderson. Ich baue mir meine Mauer selbst durch den Leib. Die eine Hälfte fault sofort, die andere mit der Zeit. Common literary portraits of Anderson throughout the 80s emphasised the precarity of the writer's lifestyle as social outcasts, and in particular the restrictive social-political background that framed their poetic endeavours. Early critics, for instance, congratulated Anderson on his radical, disillusioned view of his country and welcomed his cryptic, associative style of poetry that, admittedly, more often than not, verged on hermeticism and incomprehensibility, and more so as he went along. They responded positively to his grim preoccupation with death, powerlessness, fragmentation, alienation and despair, offering explanations rooted in the extraordinary circumstances and unparalleled zeitgeist of Anderson's milieu. And even when in 1988, when he was actually in the West, Anderson published a volume of unrelenting poems, this shown here, called Brunnen Randvoll, with painter friend Ralph Kerbach, in which Anderson worked through his experience of violence in jail. Even then, critics persevered with the increasing hermeticism of his writing and praised his drastic language and elusive poetic images. Far more than the literary portraits of the time, photographic portraits capture Anderson as a multimedia artist and a member of an art house band in Dresden, because he actually came from Dresden and moved to the Prenzlauer Berg, like a lot of them did. So he formed an art house band with a number of his painter friends that they gave the name of Zwitschermaschine to. As it transpires, a reference to this painting of the same name by the expressionist, surrealist, modernist, avant-garde painter, Swiss painter, Paul Klee. The reference to a song machine was no doubt intended as a cipher of powerlessness and individualisation, not only in a dictatorship, but as part of an East-Western post-modern condition. And this is more or less how... And there hasn't really been much written on this band and its connections to poetry. I'll return to this image later on, from 1922. In one of the first literary portraits and analyses of the poetry of this new generation, US scholar Christine Cosentino argued in 1985 that the daily schizophrenia of living in East Germany and a divided Germany in the Cold War found fitting expression in the poem's fractured syntax, broken rhythms, and heavy use of enjambment. References to the death of the subject and to state violence were largely interpreted as ruminations on the plight of the Prenzlauer Berg poets, languishing on the fringes of a closed society with little future. For instance, the following poem is by Anderson from his first volume with the title Jeder Satellit hat einen Killer-Satelliten, from 1982. These were read as expressions of a more general systemic victimhood. In the poem, Ich bin kein Artist, ich mach kein Spagat, ich häng mit meinem weißen Hals im heißen Draht. Ich bin kein Artist, also bleibe ich hier, auch wenn mir dabei noch das Herz gefriert. I'm not an acrobat rather than an artist, but of course there is a play on the word artiste as well. As late as 1986, Anderson was keen to stress in interviews the nexus in his works between his cultivated schizophrenia in style, on the one hand, and the surrealist late Stalinist conditions in East Germany on the other hand. Moreover, in an interview in 1986, he openly declared, Ich bin deformiert worden. Ich wusste, dass ich ein manneristisches Bild der surrealistischen DDR bin. Anderson's image of himself here evokes indirectly Paul Klee's stick figure birds from Zwitschermaschine, shackled to their perch and animated by a hand crank. It's actually a Leierkasten. The birds are emaciated deformations of nature, chained to an inhumane and inanimate organ grinder, or hurdy-gurdy or Leierkasten, that propels them to sing along to a programmed tune. Prior to the fall of the wall, the Prenzlauer Berg poets' postmodernist-inspired declarations of the end of history, politics and morality were an intrinsic part of the collective portrait of this new breed of Eastern Bloc poet. Not only were they courted by scholars, they were sought out by international poets, such as here, the US beat poet Allen Ginsberg. For Ginsberg, they showed that communist art could also be aesthetically complex and challenging. For the left in particular, the aesthetics and politics of the Prenzlauer Berg poets were also proof that a radical politics could also be achieved through playing with language, syntax, and metaphor. What has been papered over or airbrushed in these Cold War portraits of the charismatic bohemian artist living in a dictatorship is a further series of contradictions. I should mention at this point, and it's mainly because I've came across this image, that the images of Anderson as a young man were thoroughly seductive. In this photograph of the artist as a young man, which is possibly a private one, it actually appears in the documentary film that I'll talk about briefly, called Anderson. So I believe it's a private photograph. Anderson appears with a seductive, knowing smile as someone who has either just climbed out of bed or is just about to go into bed and take off his clothes. On closer analysis, the habitus of the entire underground was riddled with paradoxes, and scholarly portraits and feuilletons reproduce these contradictions rather uncritically. For instance, many poets regarded themselves as anarchists, and yet they harboured deeply ambivalent attitudes to the regime. It was a type of orderly anarchism. Many, for instance, would have been only too happy to participate in official literary life and publish in the GDR, if they were permitted to, or even become a member of the Writers' Guild. And that was also Anderson's ambition, to be fully integrated. Anderson in particular was profoundly ambitious, as other photographs with prominent poets and dramatists from the East and West indicate. And there are actually a whole series of portraits where you see Anderson with Hannah Müller and presenting himself always in the foreground. Very few of Anderson's generation wanted to leave the GDR, in fact, and go into exile, although eventually many did, including Anderson in 1986 and his friends Kerbach earlier. In reality, they did not see themselves as dissidents, preferring to call themselves something less confrontational, oppositionelle. And the greatest paradox of all was, of course, that some in the underground were Stasi informants, relaying everything about their oppositional activities back to the Stasi. Perceptions and images of Anderson from the 80s contain far more inconsistencies than scholars and journalists in the West like to admit. The most damning contradiction, which was whitewashed in all the literary portraits of Anderson from the time, no doubt understandably, stems from rumours that Anderson was working for the Stasi. In the 2014 documentary by Anne-Kathrin Hendel named Anderson, former friends recall that there were always rumours about Anderson being a Stasi informant. Some even claim it was an open secret. Close friends such as Bert Pappenfuss maintain that there were indeed rumours to that effect, but he was convinced there was no basis for them. Ralf Kerbach, another close friend, painter close friend, has recently maintained, and he's a professor for art history in Dresden, at the Kunsthochschule, has recently maintained he had no idea Anderson was working for the Stasi. As I think possibly this fond portrait I happened to find by Kerbach suggests, painted in 1982, just after he went into exile. And that's clearly Anderson there. You can recognise his John Lennon glasses and his hair. I think this might be Cornelia Schleimer, who was another of the artists in the scene, and possibly that's a self-portrait of Kerbach. So this was from 82, and in a sense, when he was obviously missing them. One further contradiction that dominant portraits of Anderson erased was the fact that Anderson himself alluded to acts of betrayal, albeit of an unspecified kind, in his work. Although Anderson's poetry from the 80s gestures unmistakably towards an open form of self-portraiture, it was consistently read, and possibly misread from our perspective, along existential, I would argue, more Western postmodern lines. As Cosentino writes, Andersons Poems lassen sich als Biografie befrachteter Selbstdarstellungen lesen, in denen der Ich-Sprecher seiner Spaltung bewusst zu sein scheint und sie reflektierend umkreist. Yet, with the knowledge of hindsight, it's easy to see collusion with the Stasi as an obvious referent in many poems. For example, when Anderson writes, Die Monologe gehen fremd über einen Bahnhof, zwischen woher und wohin. And for a while there, Anderson travelled between Berlin by train back to Dresden to meet his Stasi officers. Would be one concrete reference. In an early poem, when he confesses to the paradox of being a fragmented and yet still self-identical subject, he writes, Und ich spalte mich, ihr Lieben, und bin immerfort der eine. Ich weiß, dass dieselben wiederkehren, nur andere zu sein. Indeed, this stylization, as schizophrenic, could be read into R.R. Penk's, another of Anderson's close friends, portrait of Anderson from 1990. So I stumbled across this portrait. And this was, of course, before the Stasi associations were known. Anderson is represented starkly, starkly as a naked, disembodied head against a shadowy backdrop, which throws his head into stark relief. The head could almost be a skull, maybe a death mask, if not for the intensity of the eyes. Multiple crisscrossing lines are inscribed into the face and head at various angles, lines that constantly meet other lines at crossroads. Penk's portrait, interestingly, bears resemblances to another series of works that I discovered from the same time of upheaval and transition called Schmerzblatt, and the lines, and I think, in a sense, point to a sort of existential anguish in both of them. It's not a different style for Penk. Penk was mainly known for his hieroglyphs, his sort of primitivist, a lot of stick figures, also going back to Klee. The series of debates now we'll move on to the 90s. The series of debates that led to a reassessment of GDR literature also occasioned the radical revision of the public image of Anderson. By the end of the 80s, Anderson had maintained his pan-German profile in literary and art circles while in exile, as this photograph shows. Even after the fall of the wall, Anderson appears, like in this photograph, comfortable with his image as the epitome of subcultural studied cool, hiding like a rock star behind opaque sunglasses, ostentatiously smoking a cigarette. Anderson had accrued so much cultural capital in circles, in social and cultural circles, that many, including journalists such as Iris Radisch from Die Zeit, were incredulous when Wolf Biermann first exposed Anderson, denouncing him as Sasha Arschloch in his Bühnerpreisrede in October 91. The media demanded proof and initially sided with Anderson. A few of his friends, such as Holger Kolleg, Penk and Kerbach, were shocked, but hopeful that the allegations would not be substantiated. Yet, once Jürgen Fuchs had provided proof and published in the Spiegel, sufficient numbers of others found references to the ubiquitous informant with the undercover names David Menzer, Fritz Müller, and Peters in their files, opinion shifted, and even former friends denounced Anderson for betraying their trust. And I found these other interesting works, including a suitcase, and Biermann, of course, is the one with the big moustache, and Anderson. The once charismatic icon of resistance and beacon of hope for his generation morphed overnight into a scapegoat and a figure of outrage, disgust and disappointment. Although Anderson did not appear to have signed a Verpflichtungserklärung, the evidence in the files was overwhelming. In 2000, copies of his 11-volume EM Vorgang file, once thought destroyed, surfaced, and I got a copy very early on of this. And delivered definitive proof that Anderson was registered as an informant from 1975 to 89. Anderson's contemporaries struggled to absorb the news that they had been betrayed and duped by Anderson on such a massive scale, and the damaging portrait of the artist as a young spy, if you like, overshadowed public perceptions of the entire group, whose authenticity was now called into question. Frank Schirmacher denounced the entire Prenzlauer Berg poets as a perfide Simulation der Stasi. Wolf Biermann belittled them, calling them spätdadaistische Gartenzwerge. Of course, because he was the giant, right? Biermann has a tendency to denounce everybody, irrespective of the generation. And the Prenzlauer Berg was a blue, to stay in his metaphor of Gartenzwerge, the Prenzlauer Berg was a blühende Schrebergarten der Stasi. Since 1992, duplicity, like betrayal and deception, have become ubiquitous tropes in all analyses of Anderson's habitus, and most portraits of him. Iris Radisch, in her exposures about Anderson for die Zeit, namely Die Krankheit Lüge, in one titled Die Krankheit Lüge, wrote, ständig schwankt die Zahl seiner Kinder und seiner Lebensjahre. Sein Vater verbreitet Anderson sei ein Shakespeare-Forscher. Former friends interviewed for Handel's documentary film about Anderson stressed that they'd always known about Anderson's love of playing with the truth. They accepted it as part of a Sasha system. Anderson used to say he had a Russian father, and indeed, in the documentary, Anderson performs a brief autobiographical sketch that stresses his Russian connections, grandparents' generation. Some of Anderson's deliberately propagated legends about his parentage made their way into his Stasi files, somewhat surprisingly. In one version found in his file, according to an informant, Anderson used to tell people he was the son of a Swedish mother and an American military pilot who died in Vietnam. In another, he was the son of the Jewish American-born writer Edith Anderson. American, Jewish, Russian, all the same, according to Anderson. Of course, there is this possibility that he was having a bit of fun with someone he might have suspected was working for the Stasi. But I think more generally it was part of a Sasha system. Indeed, not only was the myth of Anderson dismantled in the 90s, his entire biography was re-evaluated. According to Stasi expert Joachim Walter, writing in 96, there are a number of facts about Anderson's biography that do not stand up to scrutiny. For instance, it's unclear whether Anderson was born in Weimar, according to Walter. Walter speculates that he may have been adopted. The official version, of course, is that Anderson's mother worked in the DEFA animation film studios, and his father was a dramaturg in a theatre in Bautzen. While these facts appear to be accurate, in the autobiography Anderson published in 2002, which we see here, Anderson can't resist poeticizing his parentage. He alludes to his father as someone who extended play acting into real life. Anderson's autobiographical writing also includes other references to a childhood spent in the surrounds of the theatre, and to his father as a shadowy figure pulling the strings of a marionette behind the scenes. Wollte die Marionetten zum Tanzen bringen, sie sprechen bringen, he writes about his father. Anderson liked to cultivate an aura of mystery around himself. And after 89, he continued to fictionalise aspects of his life, his origins and his parents, as if nothing had changed. 10 years later, in the autobiography, published by the Cologne publishing house Dumont, a mainstream publishing house, Anderson attempts to recapture much of his lost coolness, reassembling himself as a literary figure rather than as a young spy, in various national traditions, and he invokes literary forebears such as Novalis, Russian forebears, and surprisingly even Wolf Biermann. Obviously doesn't hold a grudge. In the historical scholarship about Anderson, especially in studies based on the Stasi archives about informants, Anderson's biography stands out to this day as an example of an open figuration of a literary life under communism. Walter speaks of glaring gaps, of bemerkenswerte weiße Flecken in Anderson's life that the Stasi files have not helped to clarify. In particular, Walter claims that there is a year that is unaccounted for. Anderson maintains that in 1979 he spent time in prison for cheque fraud, and in the film he states that he added a zero to a cheque for 100 marks, turning into 1,000 marks. Yet Walter claims there are no records of Anderson being in jail. Surprisingly, the Stasi files do seem to corroborate Anderson's account. In one file, he tells his Dresden officers at an undercover meeting that he expected to be arrested soon, and his officers later reported that he didn't turn up to a meeting, and that would be no doubt be because he was in prison. And then they say, we're going to find out where he is, and then the next file says, we have discovered that he is in Schwarze Pumpe, a Justizvollzugsanstalt. Walter didn't know probably this file at the time. He hypothesises that Anderson, and this was obviously speculation that was rife in artistic circles at the time, that Anderson might have been in a Stasi training camp where he's being prepared for becoming a mole or a Trojan horse in the underground. And to this day, this myth persists about his year in jail, although there's no further proof, except possibly, I've looked for some further signs that could allude to this, possibly a line in a poem where Anderson states that the barbed wire, if you want to see that as a reference to the prison, is a lie. And thus the story about the prison may possibly be a fabrication. Despite the fact that the Stasi files hold out the promise of certainty about many facets of Anderson's life, a careful reading of his dossier raises further inconsistencies and unexplained mysteries about his life. For instance, it's not clear from the files exactly why Anderson went into exile in 1986. Was it on his own initiative or part of a Stasi plan to work as an informer on the West, for instance, to spy on people like Jürgen Fuchs? It's not entirely clear. Was his recruitment his own initiative or the Stasi's? And why did he resist working for the Stasi from 75 to 80, as the files suggest, only to give in to the Stasi's demands in 1980? And what happened in the missing year in his vitae? I conclude. Both the public image of Anderson in the 80s as a young bohemian artist struggling on the fringes of a dictatorship, and the later largely closed portraits of Anderson in the 90s as a Stasi spy do not do justice to the many inconsistencies in the various figurations of his life, nor do they do justice to the many conflicting dimensions of his identity, which were often erased or explained via acceptable Western models, say of postmodernity or neue Subjektivität in poetry, for instance. In the 80s, there were many aspects to his persona as an artist that were indeed baffling and contradictory, including rumours that he was a spy. In fact, his poetry had always alluded to multiple forces shaping the poetic eye in quasi-confessional modes of writing and in images and metaphors that suggest, of course, in retrospect, that we read them, that they can be read as broad hints about his double life as a poet and a spy. As Thomas Assauer wrote in 1992, Anderson hat den Versen den Verrat verraten. There are countless instances of Anderson's poems that refer to alibis, names that could be read as false or code names or Decknamen, to marionettes, limousines, ears, eyes, and to doubles, masks, split identities and selves, and even to reckonings and guilt. One poem talks about a fingierte Metapher, another about a Metaphern, die ich verrate. And of course, the satellite in the title of Anderson's poetry volume could also be read as a reference to his activity as an informant in perpetual orbit around various underground scenes in the Republic. Scholarly readings consistently interpreted these self-portraits according to familiar explanations of convergence between East and West, often but not always affecting a type of closure on them. In the 90s, these closed images were widely challenged but replaced by other, equally closed depictions of Anderson as an amoral Stasi informant. The media image dominant of Anderson in the 90s as a simulated underground artist and as a Stasi Trojan horse is for that reason also an oversimplification. Anderson's Stasi file reveals that he saw himself first and foremost as an artist, only becoming a willing Stasi informant once he believed he'd found a formula for pursuing, no matter how perverse this formula was, but he believed, I think, he found a formula for pursuing his own artistic agenda while keeping the Stasi at bay or happy. And there is this line from his autobiography where he says, "Und so kamen sie mit den Informationen, die ich ihnen gab, zu ihrem und ich mittels der Information, die sie mir gaben, zu meinem Ziel." No? Clear, cut and dried. He writes, moreover, his Stasi files suggest that although Anderson incriminated countless members of the underground, his friends included, but to a less extent his friends, he was also subject to sustained Stasi pressure from 75 to 80 in the early years, including to violence in jail, if we believe the Stasi records, although that is still in doubt. By the same token, his independence must surely count as a massive illusion. He believed he was, as the Leonard Cohen song goes, like a bird on a wire that tries to be free. I won't sing it. However, rather than the autonomous, self-reflexive subject, he mimicked possibly one of Klee's birds, who are anything but free. He remained harnessed to a wire operated by an omnipotent hand that he could not see. The real blind spot in his life writing is indeed his ambivalent relationship to the invisible hand of power, the hand that cranks the wire on which the birds are sitting and forces them to twitter to the pre-programmed script of the state's organ grinder, its handmaiden, the Stasi. What Anderson is unable to reflect on and show remorse for is that he was in all this a willing accomplice. He consented to be part of a Stasi experiment, to create a Trojan horse-like machine to destroy the opposition he was part of. And he thereby did irreparable damage not only to himself and his art, but to that of his friends as well. Thank you.